A lie is a bridge burned before it is ever crossed. A promise broken in the silent space between one language and another. In the hushed opulence of the restaurant's private Polaris suite, where deals were forged in whispers over plates of glistening sea bass, a betrayal was unfolding molecule by molecule. Lena felt it in the subtle shift of the air, a dissonance in the room's expensive, curated harmony. She moved between the tables with a practiced invisibility, a ghost in a crisp white shirt and black vest, her presence designed to be felt only as a seamless service. But she was not invisible. She was merely observing from a place no one thought to look. Her hands, steady as they refilled crystal water glasses, did not betray the tremor in her soul. She had been a ghost for 2 years, ever since the fire of her former life had been extinguished, leaving her in this grayscale existence. Tonight, however, colors were bleeding back in, sharp and dangerous. At the head of the long mahogany table sat Mr. Kwan, a man whose stillness was a form of power. His face was a mask of placid control, but his hands, resting beside a leather-bound folder, were tense, the knuckles white. He was a predator at rest. Opposite him, 2 Americans smiled with the easy confidence of men who believed they held the superior position. Between them, translating, was Julian. Polished, handsome, with a voice as smooth as the aged scotch in their glasses, Julian was the bridge between 2 worlds. And Lena, with a fluency in both languages that would have shocked every person in that room, knew the bridge was compromised. She heard the subtle twist, the slight softening of Mr. Kwan's unyielding terms, the insertion of a single, ambiguous adjective that changed a demand into a polite request. It was masterfully done, a poison administered in a single, elegant drop. Her heart began a low, heavy drum against her ribs. The clink of her wine key against a bottle was the only sound that betrayed her inner turmoil, a tiny metallic cry in the silent, gilded cage of the room. This was not her fight. This was not her world anymore. Her world was now one of polished silver and folded napkins, of memorizing specials and ensuring the salt cellars were full. But the ghost of her father whispered to her, a voice from the ruins of her past, speaking of integrity as the only foundation that could never be washed away. She saw his face, the disappointment not in her failure, but in the world's casual cruelty. She had promised herself she would remain unseen, but how could she watch a man be led off a cliff by a guide he trusted implicitly? The weight of her hidden knowledge was immense, a physical pressure building behind her eyes. She drew a quiet, steadying breath, the air thick with the scent of money and deceit. Something had to be done. The deception was not a single crack in the foundation. It was a deliberate, systematic demolition. As Lena performed the silent ballet of service, clearing plates, offering bread, her movements fluid and unobtrusive, she became an unwilling auditor of a grand betrayal. She listened, not with the passive ear of a server, but with the hyper-focused intensity of the person she used to be, an international arbiter, a woman who once lived and breathed the nuances of contractual language. Julian's voice, a melodic baritone, flowed effortlessly, yet each sentence he spoke was a carefully crafted falsehood. When Mr. Kwan stated, his tone like chilled steel, the liability clause is non-negotiable and absolute, Julian turned to the Americans and smiled reassuringly. Mr. Kwan feels there is room for flexibility on the finer points of the liability structure, pending a review of your proposed amendments. It was a lie of staggering audacity. Lena's hand paused for a fraction of a second over a bread basket, her knuckles brushing the warm linen. She watched Julian's eyes. They never wavered. He was a consummate performer. He wasn't just mistranslating words. He was rewriting the very soul of the negotiation, steering the outcome toward a destination of his own design. He was remodeling the architecture of the deal in real time, brick by treacherous brick. The Americans, hearing only what they wanted to hear, nodded, their expressions softening. They believed they were winning, taming the fearsome titan of industry. They had no idea their victory was an illusion, a script being fed to them by the man they paid to be their voice of truth. Lena felt a cold fury rise within her, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in years. It was the same fury she had felt sitting in a sterile boardroom as her own career was dismantled by a series of elegant, professional lies, her name and reputation dissolving under the acid of a well-orchestrated smear campaign. She recognized the methodology, the confidence, the utter lack of conscience. She looked at Mr. Kwan, a man of immense power, being rendered impotent by a single, untrustworthy voice. He was a king being advised by a traitor, and he did not even know it. The quiet hum of the room's air conditioning seemed to grow louder, a menacing drone that vibrated through the floor. The weight on her was no longer just knowledge, it was responsibility. She was the sole witness to a crime being committed in plain sight, a silent assassination of a multi-billion-dollar deal. To remain a ghost was to be an accomplice. Lena retreated into the hushed, metallic world of the service corridor, her back pressing against the cool stainless steel of a wine refrigerator. The rhythmic thrum of the machine vibrated through her spine, a mechanical heartbeat counting down the seconds of her indecision. Here, away from the gilded cage of the Polaris suite, the reality of her situation crashed down upon her. Her life was a fragile structure she had painstakingly assembled from the wreckage of her past. This job, this uniform, this cloak of invisibility, it was all that stood between her and utter ruin. It paid the rent on her small apartment and serviced the mountain of debt left behind by her father's legal battles. To intervene was to risk it all. They would fire her instantly. A scene in a private room with men of this caliber was unforgivable. Best-case scenario, she would be escorted out, jobless and disgraced once more. Worst case? These were not just corporate executives. The rumors about Mr. Kwan's enterprise were dark and pervasive. Involving herself could mean inviting a danger she couldn't possibly comprehend. The door to the dining room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Silence was safety. Silence was survival. But the ghost of her father was with her in the corridor, his presence more real than the steel at her back. He had been a civil engineer, a man who built literal bridges. His philosophy, which he had drilled into her from childhood, was that integrity was the ultimate load-bearing structure. A bridge with a single weak joint is not a bridge, he used to say. It is a beautifully engineered catastrophe. His own catastrophe had come when a rival firm falsified stress reports, causing a municipal project to be condemned. They hadn't just ruined his company, they had erased his name, his legacy. He had died 2 years later, a man hollowed out by a lie. Julian was that weak joint. He was the falsified report. And she, Lena, was the only inspector on site who knew it. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished steel door, a tired-looking woman in a server's uniform. But behind the eyes was the flicker of someone else, someone who once commanded boardrooms, who could dismantle a fallacious argument in 3 different languages before breakfast. Could she let that person die completely? To walk away now would be the final betrayal, not of Mr. Kwan, but of her father and of the person she was meant to be. The moral calculus was terrifyingly simple, her fragile safety versus a truth that needed to be spoken. Her hand went to the simple silver chain around her neck, a locket containing a tiny, folded piece of drafting paper from her father's old desk. It was a choice between fear and legacy. She closed her eyes, took one deep, shuddering breath, and made the decision. She would not be a ghost tonight. She would be a bridge. Her plan formed with the swift, cold clarity of a winter morning. There was only one way. It had to be direct, deniable, and delivered at a moment of maximum vulnerability. She selected the most expensive bottle of wine from the refrigerator, a 1982 Chateau Margaux, a vintage so rare it was spoken of in reverent tones. It was the perfect shield, a legitimate reason to approach the head of the table with the deference he would expect. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Her palms were slick with sweat, but her hands, as she uncorked the bottle with a surgeon's precision, were rock steady. This was muscle memory from a different life, the performance of absolute competence under pressure. She walked back into the Polaris suite. The air was thick with false cordiality. Julian was in the middle of another translation, his voice a silken thread weaving a tapestry of lies. Lena moved toward the head of the table, her steps measured and silent on the plush carpet. All eyes were on the negotiator, but she felt Mr. Kwan's peripheral gaze register her approach with the bottle. This was it. The point of no return. She stopped at his left shoulder, her body angled to shield her mouth from the view of anyone else at the table. She leaned in, the bottle poised over his glass, adopting the posture of an attentive sommelier. "A truly exceptional vintage, sir," she murmured in perfect, formal English, loud enough for the others to hear. Then, as she tilted the bottle and the deep ruby liquid began to flow, she lowered her voice to a whisper that was barely a breath, switching to his native tongue, the words precise and unaccented. "Your translator is lying." She held his gaze for a single, searing second. His eyes, which had been placid and observant, sharpened instantly, the pupils contracting like a camera lens focusing in sudden, brilliant light. There was no shock, no confusion. There was only a flash of cold, terrifying comprehension. He understood. She saw it. She straightened up, placing the bottle on the table with a soft, deliberate click. The sound seemed to cannon through the silent room. She gave a slight, formal bow and retreated, her back tingling, every nerve ending screaming. She did not look back. As she reached the service door, she could feel the entire gravitational field of the room shift and pivot, collapsing around the two small, explosive words she had just delivered. She had lit the fuse. Now, all she could do was wait for the detonation, hoping she would not be caught in the blast. The door swung shut behind her, and she finally allowed herself to lean against the wall, her legs trembling. The silence that followed from the other side was the most frightening sound she had ever heard. The silence from the Polaris suite stretched for an agonizing minute. Lena stood in the corridor, her ear pressed lightly against the wood, her breath held tight in her chest. She could hear nothing but the frantic thumping of her own blood. Then, the low murmur of conversation resumed. For a terrifying moment, she thought he had ignored her, dismissed her as a delusional servant. Perhaps she had misread him entirely. The thought sent a wave of nausea through her. But then, the quality of the sound from within the room changed. Mr. Kwan's voice, when he finally spoke, was different. The placid, almost gentle tone he had used before was gone, replaced by something flat and hard, like a sheet of ice. He said something short and commanding. Lena didn't need to hear the words to understand the intent. He was setting the trap. He allowed Julian to translate one more exchange, his eyes never leaving the translator's face. He was watching the mechanics of the lie, studying the performance now that he knew it was a sham. He was gathering his own proof. Then, he raised a hand, a simple gesture that brought the entire meeting to a dead halt. The silence that fell this time was absolute, heavy with unspoken tension. "Julian," Mr. Kwan said, his English perfect, devoid of any accent. The casual use of his own language was the first shot fired. "Would you be so kind as to repeat my last statement to our guests?" "Verbatim, if you please." Julian's smile faltered for the first time, a barely perceptible tremor at the corner of his mouth. He began to stammer, trying to reconstruct the lie he had just told. But Mr. Kwan did not wait for his answer. He turned his gaze directly to the two American executives, his eyes holding a chillingly calm fire. And then, in their own language, with a fluency that was both eloquent and disarming, he spoke. "Gentlemen, it appears there has been a significant misunderstanding, one I feel compelled to correct personally." The color drained from Julian's face. The Americans stared, mouths agape, their minds scrambling to process this sudden, shocking plot twist. The man they thought they were outmaneuvering, the foreign monolith they assumed needed a bridge to their world, had been standing on their side of the river the entire time, listening to every word. Mr. Kwan proceeded to calmly, methodically deconstruct every lie Julian had told over the past hour, laying the truth bare on the polished mahogany table. With each sentence, Julian seemed to shrink, his expensive suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big. The confrontation was not loud or explosive. It was quiet, surgical, and utterly devastating. The room had become a courtroom, and Mr. Kwan was the judge, jury, and executioner. Two of his security guards, who had been standing impassively by the door, moved to flank Julian's chair, their presence a silent, final verdict. The deal was dead. The betrayal was exposed. And Lena, listening from the other side of the door, finally let out the breath she had been holding, her body slumping in a wave of terrifying relief. The aftermath was swift and silent. The American executives were escorted out through a side exit, their faces a mixture of confusion and humiliation. Julian was taken away through another, his expression vacant with shock. The Polaris suite, once a theater of high-stakes negotiation, fell silent. Lena was preparing to clock out, to slip away into the anonymity of the night, when the restaurant manager approached her, his face pale. "Mr. Kwan wishes to see you," he said, his voice a nervous squeak. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But she had come this far. She straightened her vest, smoothed her apron, and walked back into the room. Mr. Kwan was alone, seated at the head of the now-empty table, a single glass of water in front of him. The leather folder was closed. He gestured to the chair opposite him, the one Julian had occupied. Lena sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a long moment, he simply studied her, his gaze intense and analytical, as if he were trying to solve a complex equation. "You speak my language fluently," he stated. It was not a question. "Yes, sir," Lena replied, her voice steady. "And you understand the intricacies of contract law," again a statement. "I used to," he leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. A waitress at a restaurant does not typically possess such a unique combination of skills. "So I will ask you directly. Who are you?" The question hung in the air, demanding more than just her name. It demanded her story. The dam she had built around her past finally broke. The words came out in a controlled, even tone, but they carried the weight of 2 years of suppressed grief and anger. "My name is Lena Wallace," she began. "Until 2 years ago, I was a senior associate at Sterling Vance Global, specializing in international arbitration. I was on the fast track to a partnership." She told him everything. About her father, the brilliant engineer. About the rival firm, a corporate behemoth named Omnicorp, and their ruthless tactics. She explained how they had framed her for leaking sensitive client data during a major arbitration, an arbitration where she was representing a company Omnicorp was trying to acquire. They had created a false digital trail, bribed a junior IT technician for testimony, and systematically destroyed her reputation. She was disbarred, professionally exiled, and left with crippling legal debts. Her father, whose own career had been destroyed by the same company years earlier, fought for her until his health gave way. "I took this job because no one in the legal or corporate world would touch me," she finished, her voice quiet but clear. "I needed to disappear. To be invisible." Mr. Kwan listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she was done, he sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "Omnicorp," he said, the name tasting like poison on his tongue. "They are the parent company of the men who are here tonight." And Julian, he was their instrument. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't just about one bad translator. It was the same enemy, the same snake, still biting at the heels of its rivals. She hadn't just stumbled into a random act of corporate espionage. She had walked right back into the epicenter of her own destruction. In the days that followed, Lena existed in a state of suspended animation. She continued her shifts at the restaurant, the familiar routine a fragile anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The Polaris suite remained empty, a silent monument to the night that had fractured her carefully constructed peace. She heard nothing from Mr. Kwan. The silence was a new kind of torture, feeding the doubt that gnawed at her. Had he believed her? Or had he simply dealt with his immediate problem and discarded her as an anomaly, a strange but ultimately irrelevant footnote to the evening's drama? She found herself compulsively checking the news, scanning financial reports for any mention of Mr. Kwan's company or Omnicorp, searching for ripples from the stone she had thrown. There was nothing. The corporate world, it seemed, had absorbed the aborted deal without a trace. Her life felt precariously balanced on a knife's edge. The invisibility she had once craved now felt like a suffocating shroud. By intervening, she had made herself visible again, if only for a moment, and she didn't know if the consequences would be liberation or a new, more dangerous form of exile. One afternoon, as she polished wine glasses behind the bar, a sleek black car pulled up outside the restaurant. A man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit entered and asked for her by name. He wasn't from the restaurant's management. He was one of Mr. Kwan's men. He handed her a thick, sealed envelope. "Mr. Kwan requested I deliver this to you personally," he said, his voice polite but firm. He turned and left without another word. Lena took the envelope to the staff break room, her hands trembling as she tore it open. It wasn't a letter. It was a dossier. Inside were dozens of pages of documents, internal Omnicorp emails, encrypted financial transactions, sworn affidavits, and detailed digital forensics reports. It was a complete, systematic demolition of the case that had been built against her 2 years ago. Mr. Kwan's team had not just investigated Julian. They had exhumed her entire professional life. They had found the bribed IT technician, now living in another country, and secured a confession. They had traced the flow of money from an Omnicorp slush fund to the technician's offshore account. They had unearthed the fabricated emails, proving they were created on an Omnicorp server and planted on her work laptop. It was all there in black and white, irrefutable proof of her innocence. At the bottom of the stack was a single sheet of paper with a short, typed note. It was an address, the headquarters of Mr. Kwan's corporation, and a time for a meeting the following day. He had not just believed her, he had vindicated her. The documents were more than just evidence. They were the key to the cage she had been living in. The conspiracy was far deeper and more insidious than Lena could have imagined. As she read through the dossier Mr. Kwan's team had assembled, the full scope of Omnicorp's predatory strategy came into terrifying focus. Julian was not an isolated operative. He was a single, highly effective tool in a vast arsenal of corporate warfare. The investigation revealed that Omnicorp had been systematically targeting Mr. Kwan's global expansion for over a year. They had a dedicated, covert division focused solely on industrial sabotage. They placed compromised individuals, translators, junior analysts, administrative assistants, inside the operations of their targets and their potential partners. These operatives were trained to subtly alter data, misrepresent communications, and introduce small, almost imperceptible points of friction into negotiations. Their goal was not to cause catastrophic failures, but to ensure that deals soured, trust eroded, and partnerships fell apart through 1,000 tiny cuts. It was a slow, methodical poisoning. Julian's brazen lies during the dinner were an act of desperation, a high-risk move because Mr. Kwan's deal with the American firm would have given him a critical foothold in a market Omnicorp considered exclusively their own. The dossier detailed at least 3 other major international deals Mr. Kwan's company had pursued that had mysteriously collapsed at the final stage. Reviewing the new evidence, Lena could see Omnicorp's fingerprints all over them. The same pattern of miscommunication, of terms suddenly becoming unacceptable, of trust inexplicably dissolving. It was a ghost army, waging a silent war in boardrooms and back channels across the globe. But the most chilling revelation was the direct link between her own downfall and this larger campaign. The executive at Omnicorp, who had overseen the sabotage of her father's company and later orchestrated the frame-up that ended her career, was the same man in charge of the division targeting Mr. Kwan. His name was Marcus Thorne. He had seen Lena's rising talent in arbitration as a future threat and had eliminated her preemptively. It wasn't personal. It was just a strategic move on a global chessboard. She had not been a victim of random corporate malice. She had been one of the first casualties in a long, undeclared war. The knowledge was both terrifying and liberating. Her ruin had not been a meaningless tragedy. It was a piece of a much larger puzzle. And now, holding the evidence in her hands, she was no longer just a victim. She was a witness. Mr. Kwan had not just cleared her name. He had armed her. He had given her the truth, a weapon far more powerful than any lie. The file was a map of the enemy's territory, and she knew the terrain better than anyone. The next day, Lena stood before the towering glass and steel monolith of Kwan Industries. The building soared into the sky, a declaration of power and permanence that was the antithesis of her life for the past 2 years. The simple waitress uniform was gone, replaced by the best suit she still owned, a charcoal gray relic from her former life that she had kept preserved in plastic, a silent testament to a future she thought had been stolen from her. She walked through the revolving doors, her reflection moving with her across the polished black marble floor. This was the world she had been cast out of, and returning to it felt like stepping onto a foreign planet. An executive assistant met her in the lobby and escorted her to the top floor. The elevator ascended in silence, the city unfolding below them like a blueprint. The doors opened directly into Mr. Kwan's office, a vast, minimalist space with a panoramic view of the skyline. He was not behind his desk. He was standing by the window, looking out at the city, his back to her. "The view from up here is different," he said, without turning around. "You can see how all the bridges connect the city. How vulnerable they are. How much trust we place in them every day." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Omnicorp, and men like Marcus Thorne, they do not build. They only seek to weaken the foundations of others." He gestured to a large conference table where 2 sets of the dossier she had received were laid out. "My legal team has reviewed what my investigators found. They believe we have enough to launch a full-scale corporate espionage lawsuit that will not only expose Omnicorp's practices, but will also lead to criminal charges. Your testimony and this evidence," he tapped one of the folders, "will be the cornerstone of that case." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "This will mean stepping back into the light, Ms. Wallace. Your name will be everywhere. The world you tried to hide from will be watching." This was the crux of it all. He was offering her a path back, but it was a path through the very fire that had burned her before. "I am not offering you a reward," he continued, his voice low and intense. "I am offering you a position. My head of international negotiations retired last month. The division is vulnerable. I need someone to rebuild it. Someone who understands the architecture of a deal, but more importantly, someone who understands the nature of the termites that try to eat away at the foundation. I need someone with your skills, your integrity. I need a bridge builder who knows how to spot a weak joint from a mile away." It was more than a job offer. It was a chance at redemption, a chance to reclaim her name, to finish the fight her father had started, to turn the greatest injustice of her life into her greatest strength. It was an opportunity to stop being a ghost and become a fortress. Lena looked from Mr. Kwan to the sprawling city below, a complex network of steel and light, of connections and commerce. For 2 years, she had felt like a ghost haunting its edges, invisible to the vibrant life pulsing through its arteries. Now, she was being invited back to its very heart. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. The memories of public humiliation, of watching her name dragged through the mud, were fresh and raw. Marcus Thorne and Omnicorp were a formidable enemy, and taking them on would mean facing that trauma head-on. She thought of the long, quiet nights in her small apartment, the weight of her father's legacy feeling like an impossible burden. She thought of the shame, the feeling of being erased. Then she looked at the dossier on the table, the neatly compiled pages of truth. It was a weapon, and Mr. Kwan was not just offering her a chance to use it for his own ends. He was offering her the chance to wield it for herself, to rewrite her own story. "When I was disbarred," Lena said, her voice quiet but gaining strength with every word, "I felt like my voice had been taken from me. The one thing I had, my ability to use language to build, to persuade, to find common ground, was turned into a liability. Hiding felt like the only option." She walked closer to the window, standing beside him, and looking out at the horizon. "My father used to say that the strongest structures are the ones that can flex under pressure, without breaking. I think I forgot that. I chose to be rigid, to hide, because I thought if I didn't move, I couldn't be broken again." She turned to face him, a new resolve hardening in her eyes. "You have not just offered me a job, Mr. Kwan. You have offered me a chance to be the person my father raised me to be. To not just build bridges, but to defend them." A small, rare smile touched Mr. Kwan's lips. "Then you accept?" Lena took a deep breath, the sterile, air-conditioned air of the office feeling like the first clean breath of a new life. I accept. The final scene is not one of dramatic courtroom battles or triumphant headlines. It is 6 months later, in a boardroom in Seoul. Lena Wallace, dressed in a sharp, dark blue suit, stands beside Mr. Kwon. She is briefing him and his executive team before a major negotiation, her voice confident, her command of the material absolute. She moves with an earned authority, her presence filling the room. She is no longer a ghost. She is visible, powerful, and whole. As she concludes her presentation, her eyes drift for a moment to her hands, resting on the polished table. They are steady. They are the hands of a builder. She feels a quiet sense of peace settle over her, a feeling of alignment with her past, her present, and her future. The memory of her father is not a weight anymore. It is a foundation. She had honored his legacy not by hiding from the world that broke him, but by re-engaging with it on her own terms, armed with the integrity he had instilled in her. She had crossed her own bridge, from ruin to redemption, and in doing so, had discovered that the strongest structures are not made of steel or concrete, but of courage. You must understand that your greatest strength is not the absence of fear, but the decision to build in spite of it.